My sister found me sitting on the curb outside our house in the middle of February, wearing a hoodie that wasn't mine, with my 2-year-old daughter asleep on my lap and a garbage bag of clothes next to my feet. The temperature was -14. She pulled up, rolled down the window, looked at me for a long second and said, "Where's your coat?" I said, "Inside." He changed the locks. She didn't say anything after that. She just put the car in park, got out, opened the back door, and started strapping Piper into the spare booster seat she kept back there, the one she'd bought when Piper was born, just in case. I watched her do it and I still couldn't cry. I'd been sitting on that curb for 40 minutes, and I couldn't cry. She got back in the driver's seat, looked at me and said, "Okay, we're going." That was it. That was the whole conversation. We drove away. I need to back up. I met my husband when I was 26. We were both at the same housewarming party in Kitchener, and he was the guy in the kitchen who actually knew how to make a proper cheese board. That sounds so small now. It sounds like nothing. But I was 26 and I thought a man who knew how to make a cheese board was a man who had his life together. His name is Fletcher. His parents are from a small town in southern Ontario, old money in the way that isn't actually old money, but feels like it because they never stop talking about the family business. His father ran a mid-size commercial flooring company. His mother had not worked a day since Fletcher was born and seemed to consider this a personal achievement. The first time I met them, at Thanksgiving, his mother asked me what my parents did. I told her my mum was a nurse and my dad drove for Canada Post. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you they're allergic to cats and you think, well, that's a choice. I should have paid more attention to that nod. Fletcher and I got married in the fall. Small wedding, backyard of a friend's property near Elora. I wore my grandmother's earrings. My sister gave a speech that made everyone cry. His parents sat at the front table and smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes, but I told myself I was imagining things. We moved into a townhouse in Guelph. Fletcher was working in sales. I was doing contract work in UX design, mostly remote. We had Piper in the spring and I went on mat leave, and that's when things started to shift in ways I couldn't quite name at first. It started with comments. His mother would come over. She was there constantly once Piper was born, which should have been a comfort but wasn't, and she'd say things like, "Oh, you're still doing it that way," about how I was feeding Piper, or burping her, or putting her down for a nap. Always that word, still. Like I'd been given correction before and simply refused to absorb it. Fletcher didn't say anything. That was what I noticed most. Not what he said. What he didn't say. Then his father offered to help us with the mortgage. At the time I was relieved. My mat leave pay was a significant drop from my contract income. Fletcher's commission had been inconsistent. His father offered to cover the difference for 6 months just to take the pressure off. Fletcher thought it was generous. I actually thought it was generous too. I did not read the agreement carefully enough. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't even really a loan. It was structured according to the paperwork I signed at their kitchen table while Piper was fussing in the carrier on my chest, and his mother was offering to take her, and I was trying to read a document that was 12 pages long. It was structured such that his father held a kind of standing financial interest in our home. There was language in there about right of recovery that I didn't fully understand and a lawyer I didn't have. 6 months became a year. His father kept extending it. We kept accepting. By the time Piper was 18 months old, his father was treating our house like a property he was managing. He would call Fletcher, never me, and ask about the state of the furnace, whether we'd had the gutters cleaned, whether we were planning to repaint before spring. Fletcher would relay these questions to me like they were normal. I started to feel like a tenant. Then I started to feel like something less than that. The real break happened on a Tuesday. Piper had a pediatrician appointment that afternoon. It wasn't urgent, just a routine 18-month check-in. But she'd been a little congested, and I wanted to ask about it. I needed the car. We had one car, a Subaru Outback that was registered in my name because when we bought it, Fletcher's credit wasn't where it needed to be. It was legally mine. His father was at the house when I came downstairs with Piper dressed and ready to go. I hadn't known he was coming. He was in the kitchen with Fletcher, and they were looking at something on a laptop. His father looked up and said, "I'm going to need the car today." I said, "I have an appointment." He said, "You can reschedule, this is business." I looked at Fletcher. Fletcher looked at the laptop. His father held out his hand. He actually held out his hand, standing in my kitchen in my house, like he was a parking attendant, and I was supposed to hand over my keys without question. And I want to be honest about this moment. I want to be honest because I know people reading this will wonder why I did what I did. And the truth is, I handed them over. I put the keys to my own car, which was registered in my name, in my father-in-law's hand, and I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and called to reschedule Piper's appointment. I've thought about that moment a lot since then. The way authority can make you do things that from the outside look insane. The way you can be so exhausted from months of small surrenders that one large one feels like nothing. Like you've already spent your protest budget and you're running on empty. That was the day I started writing things down. I kept a notes app on my phone. I didn't tell Fletcher. I didn't tell anyone. I just started documenting. Every time his father came by unannounced. Every time Fletcher relayed a suggestion that was actually an instruction. Every time I was spoken over or spoken around. I wrote it down with the date and the time and the exact words, as close as I could remember them. I called my sister one evening when Fletcher was out and Piper was asleep. I told her what had been happening. I didn't dramatize it. I just told her in a straight line the way you'd give directions. She listened without interrupting, which is not her default mode, so I knew she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, "About 8 months." She said, "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I said no. She said, "Okay, I'm going to find someone." She called me the next morning with a name. A family law paralegal in Hamilton who did a free first consultation. I made the appointment and told Fletcher I was going to lunch with a friend. The consultation was 45 minutes. I brought my notes. The paralegal, a woman in her 50s who had clearly heard all of this before and worse, looked at the agreement I'd signed at his parents' kitchen table and said, "This has some real teeth." She walked me through what the right of recovery clause meant, which was that if we ever sold the house or if the relationship dissolved, his father had a documented claim to a portion of the equity, not the money he'd lent us. The equity, which had grown considerably since we'd bought. She also told me that a car registered in my name was legally my property. That taking my keys without my consent, regardless of anything his father believed about the arrangement, was not a gray area. I drove home that day with a very different feeling than when I'd arrived. I started making moves the way you move in chess when you're playing against someone who doesn't know you know chess. Slowly, without announcement, I opened a separate bank account at a credit union across town. I started transferring a small amount each week from my design contract work I'd quietly taken on a new client while Piper napped, into that account. I scanned every document I could find in the house that related to the mortgage, the original agreement with his father, and the car registration. I uploaded them to a private folder. I changed the password to my email. I spoke to my sister once a week, always when Fletcher was out, always from the driveway in my car with the heat running. I did all of this while making dinner and reading Piper her bedtime books, and smiling at the right moments and saying nothing. The morning everything broke open. It was a Saturday in February. His parents came over without calling, which they'd been doing for months. His father walked in like he walked in everywhere, like he'd designed the space. His mother went immediately to the kitchen and started commenting on what was in the fridge. Piper was in her high chair eating toast. His father sat down at table across from Fletcher and said, and I'm telling you the exact words because I've replayed them so many times, "We've been talking. We think it makes more sense for Vivek and me to hold on to the car going forward, given the arrangement." The arrangement. That was what he called it. The arrangement. I said, "The car is registered in my name." He said, "Technically, yes." I said, "Not technically, legally." He looked at Fletcher the way men look at each other when a woman says something they weren't expecting and they need a moment to recalibrate. Fletcher looked at his toast. His father said, "We've supported this family, we've been more than fair. I think a little cooperation goes a long way." I said, "Cooperation?" He said, "We're not asking, we're telling you what the arrangement is." I got up from the table, not dramatically. I just stood up, picked up Piper from her high chair, wiped her hands with the cloth, and walked to the closet near the front door. I put her in her coat. I put on my own coat. I picked up my bag, which I had quietly packed the night before after my last phone call with my sister, and I walked out the front door. I sat in my car, which was still in the driveway because his father hadn't taken it yet, and I called my sister. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Now," she said, "give me 40 minutes. I took Piper to the park at the end of the street, even though it was cold, because I didn't want to be in the house and I didn't want to drive away before my sister arrived. We sat on the bench near the swings with Piper bundled in her red snowsuit. A dog came over and she laughed. I held her mittened hand and watched the street. His father came outside once. He stood on the front step and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The one that says you're being dramatic, you're embarrassing yourself, you'll regret this. I looked back at him. I didn't wave, I didn't move. He went back inside. My sister pulled up in her old Civic at 11:43. She parked behind my Subaru, got out and walked to the bench. She crouched down and said hi to Piper first, who immediately offered her a mittened fist as greeting. Then she straightened up and looked at me. "Ready?" she said. "I've been ready," I said. We went back to the house together. His parents were still there. Fletcher was in the living room. His father stood when we came in, the way people stand when they want to signal authority, and my sister just walked past him like he was furniture and sat down at the kitchen table. She put her tote bag on the table. She reached in and pulled out a folder. She set it in the middle of the table. She said, "We're going to talk about the car, and then we're going to talk about the house. And you're going to want to listen to both." His father said, "Who are you?" My sister said, "I'm the person who made sure she had a lawyer." What happened over the next 2 hours was not a fight, exactly. It was more like a slow unwinding. My sister had done her own research. She worked in insurance and was no stranger to reading contracts, and she'd spoken to my paralegal. She laid out calmly and without emotion what the car situation was. She laid out what the agreement with his father actually entitled him to, which was considerably less than he'd been operating as though it did. She pointed out that a married woman in Ontario has legal rights to the matrimonial home regardless of whose name is on what document. His father blustered. He talked about gratitude, about sacrifice, about everything he'd done for us. His mother started to cry, which I'd expected. Fletcher sat very still and said almost nothing, which was the version of him I'd been living with for over a year, and which I had finally, in those months of quiet preparation, made peace with. At one point his father looked at me and said, "Do you understand what you're throwing away?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You'll have nothing." I said, "I have Piper. I have my name on that car. I have a separate account you don't know about, and I have a paralegal on retainer. So I think what we have here is a difference of opinion about what nothing looks like." His mother stopped crying. His father sat down. We left that afternoon. Fletcher didn't stop us. I drove my own car. My sister drove behind me the whole way to her house in Hamilton, like she was making sure nothing could cut us off. Piper fell asleep in the back seat before we got on the highway. I watched her face in the rearview mirror for a long time. She was still wearing her red snowsuit. The months that followed were not easy, and I want to be honest about that too, because these stories sometimes collapse the hard parts into a single paragraph when they deserve more space. I stayed with my sister for 6 weeks, in her second bedroom with a pack-and-play borrowed from a friend. Piper adapted faster than I did, the way small children do. She started calling my sister's house the house with the dog because my sister's beagle, a ridiculous old boy named by my nephew as Captain, slept on the floor next to the pack-and-play every night, and apparently this was the detail Piper found most notable about the situation. I filed for separation. The process involved a mediator, which in Ontario is often recommended before going straight to court. Fletcher attended. His parents did not, which was a relief to everyone including, I think, Fletcher. The mediator was a dry, efficient woman who had absolutely no patience for posturing. Fletcher's lawyer arrived with language about his father's financial contributions. My paralegal arrived with the notes app and 12 months of documentation. The agreement with his father was reviewed. What it actually entitled him to, under scrutiny, with proper legal interpretation, was the specific sum of money he'd contributed, with a modest interest rate, not the equity stake he'd been behaving as though he held. That distinction mattered enormously. His claim on our home was reduced to a calculable dollar figure that was resolved through the division of assets. The car, my Subaru, registered in my name, was not part of any of it. Fletcher and I reached a separation agreement without going to court. We have shared custody of Piper, week on week off. He's living in a basement apartment in Guelph now, and from what Piper tells me during her bath time recaps, he has a fish. She thinks the fish is very important and updates me on its well-being regularly. I don't ask too many questions. His parents have not contacted me since the day at the mediator's office, when his father shook my paralegal's hand with the energy of a man who had not expected to need to do that. I rent a 2-bedroom place in Hamilton now, walking distance from my sister. Piper and the dog have developed a full relationship that I play no role in. She runs to him when she arrives. He shuffles to the door to meet her. It's become their thing. I took on 2 more contracts in the spring. I work from the kitchen table when Piper is at Fletcher's, and from the couch when she's with me, 'cause she likes to bring her blocks over and build things next to my laptop, quietly, with great concentration, occasionally holding one up for my review. I think about the version of me who handed over those car keys without a word. I think about her sitting on the edge of the bed calling to reschedule the appointment. I understand her. She was exhausted and isolated, and she didn't yet know that what she was living in had a name and an exit. What I want to say to her, what I'd want to say to anyone who is in that particular kind of fog, is that the preparation is the thing. Not the confrontation. Not the dramatic moment when everything comes out. The preparation, the notes app, the paralegal with the free consultation, the separate account opened on a Tuesday with $57. The sister who kept a spare booster seat in her car just in case, who answered on the second ring, who put a folder on the table and said, "We're going to talk about this now." My father-in-law thought he had leverage because he had money, and a piece of paper and a son who wouldn't push back. He thought I had nothing. He didn't know about the notes. He didn't know about the account. He didn't know that the woman across the table from him had been very quietly, very patiently, building a door for 8 months. He found out on a Saturday in February, in the kitchen he'd walked into like he owned the place, while my daughter sat in her red snowsuit on a park bench and offered her mittened fist to a stranger's dog. And when I drove away that afternoon, I drove my car.